Okay, just to show you that there's a man behind the curtain, I thought I would do something a little bit different to try to change my luck with YouTube. I might start off with a poem. YouTube. It's so stable, it's just like Jello on a table. I'm still trying to figure out the rest of that poem. So anyway, let's try again. For the 17th time, I'll cover things up since I'm such a shy boy. And let's continue with slide 23. So if you look in the Shakya readings, you'll note a mention of the Common Program, where the PRC announced in September of 1949, before the actual establishment of the People's Republic, that it would be liberating Tibet, Taiwan, the Pescadores, which are the islands in between Taiwan and the mainland, and Xinjiang. And this common program is worth talking about for a little bit. You can see the common program being passed by a comfortable majority here. Every single hand in the room is up, except for some people in the front row, I think. A requisite 1% or so are abstaining, but the rest of the people in the room are voting yes on the Common Program on 29 September 1949. And this is the first meeting of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, or the CPPCC. It still exists today, and just like the National People's Congress and the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, which are governmental and party organizations, respectively, representative organizations of the masses and the people. The CPPCC is a sham. It's a bunch of fake baloney. It is a meeting of people. This particular mass body here is and was then a meeting of non-communist individuals from different walks of society, in particular from what were then called the Democratic parties, which still exist today in form. It also includes, this gathering includes representatives of the Kuomintang themselves, not real Kuomintang members, but Kuomintang members under the aegis of the Chinese Communist Party. And they are expected, not only them, but the other two, the National People's Congress and the Central Committee, are expected before these meetings, which happen infrequently, to study the proposals of the leadership, become familiar with them, and it's suggested to them how they will vote, and then they go there and they vote the way it is suggested that they do, unless they want to end up in a bad state somewhere, in deep kimchi, in a hard place. One wouldn't want to go against instructions when attending a public forum like this. Now, the Common Program that was passed that day in Beijing is an interesting indication of the priorities of the regime, although it doesn't include everything. As I've mentioned before, the actions taken by a government in its most secret councils, such as those that led to actions by CCP intelligence or by the military, are a more interesting indication of the actual motivations and ideas about a government, because, of course, what you do in private, when nobody is looking, when there's no public accountability, can often be a little bit different than what you do in public, when everybody's looking and you're expected to be on your best behavior. They're two different things. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't study. If you're interested in understanding the intentions of a government, you shouldn't study these kinds of proclamations when they come out. The seal of the CPPCC, which I've placed in the bottom of this slide in all of its colorful brilliance is a very clear indication of who's who and what's what. You can see there red flags rising like the sun over the globe in a red China, and that red China includes a little red dot there that's also Taiwan, of course, indicating who's boss in the CPPCC. Article 1 says that the PRC is a new democratic or people's democratic state carrying out the democratic dictatorship of the people. And what that means is that the people, you could have a math formula here, there's the masses and there's the people. The masses equals the people plus the enemies. Or, if you will, the people equals the masses minus the enemies. So the Kuomintang were not part of the people, and all those who cooperated with the Kuomintang or benefited from it, whether politically or economically, who were left on the mainland after 1949, were also not part of the people. They were the enemies of the people. The people are the ones who are truly being represented, and they made up about 90% of the population. Article 2 says that the Central People's Government will liberate Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet, and the Pescadores, the islands there in between Taiwan and the mainland. It's pretty clear. Article 7, and there's a couple articles in between, too, that guarantee freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and so forth. And one has to stop and ask, after all these years, how that's working. Article 7, the PRC will suppress all counter-revolutionary activities, in particular the Kuomintang. So you can see here there's no idea of reconciliation unless someone confesses, does their time, pays off society, and then they're forgiven and they're monitored carefully. So one could be, unless one had committed murders or something, which there were plenty on both sides, unless one had committed real big crimes, then it was possible to redeem oneself by doing hard labor, being in prison, that sort of thing. But if someone was incorrigible, if they were, the phrase was stubborn, that was quite often used, if they were a stubborn Kuomintang element, then they were in for a world of hurt. Article 11, the PRC will unite with all peace-loving and freedom-loving countries, first of all the USSR and its satellite nations. So Mao Zedong had decided a couple years before that trying to do something besides uniting with the Soviet Union was a waste of time. The Americans would never give up on their alliance with Chiang Kai-shek, and even if they did, and of course the Americans were getting upset with Chiang Kai-shek during the last part of the revolution, even if they did, they would never support the Communist Party. And that is absolutely true. Going on to slide 24. So if the Communist Party was so determined to liberate Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, and so forth, why wasn't Hong Kong in that list? Why wasn't Macau in that list? After all, the Portuguese had been in China since the 1500s. The British were the most notorious of the imperialists and had used Hong Kong as a base of operations. Why weren't they liberated? They could have been, but it was very clear to anybody with a clear head that leaning to one side, to the Soviet Union, was going to carry a price tag. It was going to mean it was difficult to do business with the West, and some of that might be necessary. So these two places were kept open as windows to the West. They were administered quite differently. way back in 1557, the Portuguese actually recorded in correspondence between Macau and Lisbon the idea that all the Chinese have to do, they don't have to come in here and defeat us or anything. We could have all the military power in the world protecting Macau, but all they have to do is stop trading with us, and we won't have any food or water. I actually interviewed a Portuguese official in 1989 when I was doing export control work for the U.S. government, and he basically told me the same thing straight out of the books. Hong Kong was administered a little bit differently. They were not so much under the Chinese thumb, but they weren't stupid either. They had to walk a fine line between being a close ally of the United States and not upsetting the Chinese communists so much that they would invade the place, which they could do. It was not as if the British could have popped a nuke over Canton or something in order to prevent that. The odds were very much against them. However, at the same time, they did not do stupid things at the other end of the spectrum. For example, they did not allow the Kuomintang to use Hong Kong as a base of operations to launch either military or spy missions into the mainland, as was done by on the offshore islands that Taiwan continued to hold, at Quemoy and Matsu, Jinmen and Mazu. And both of them became bases for the United Front Work Department. They were useful in this regard, to recruit overseas Chinese to return to China. In the period between 1949 and 1955, a lot of people went back to China from overseas who had been educated overseas in order to contribute to the motherland. There was an active program to get this done, and we'll talk more about that next week. So even though Hong Kong became a port of call for U.S. warships, there was never any doubt from a geopolitical perspective that the Chinese were in control of the waters around it, and so there was never any threat. That's the other half of this formula. There was every reason to gain benefit from allowing the British and the Portuguese to continue to operate, and there was no real downside. There was no loss of control, no threat. So that's why these places were not liberated. Going on to slide 25, Macau was particularly useful in this context. There was already quite a bit of gold smuggling going on into the mainland, and it continued. It continued at an even more rapid pace once the Korean War got going, because the Chinese had things they wanted to buy and sell, and gold would go back and forth through Macau. The Portuguese dictator Salazar had conveniently left Macau out of the Bretton Woods Agreement that required reporting to international bodies of traffic in gold, and so there was no problem. Some of these gold bars that went sailing through Macau had swastikas on them because the Portuguese had taken gold from the Nazis during World War II in exchange for tungsten, otherwise known as wolfram, which is mined in Portugal. Tungsten, or wolfram, is used to harden steel, and you need it in order to have cannon shells that can pierce armor. So it was a strategic commodity, and other strategic commodities went in and out of Macau during this time. The triads, the Chinese criminal organizations, this became their safe base because the British didn't want to put up with them. And both Deng Xiaoping and another official named Tao Siju who in the 1960s and 1970s was a Minister of Public Security, called the triads patriotic organizations that the Communist Party should cooperate with. So they had their base there, and CCP intelligence could deal with them there, and so on. So anyway, that's Macau. Interesting place, great food, great wine, very interesting architecture. You can go there and have a great time and not bother with the gambling. Slide 26. So the Civil War, by late 1948, was a foregone conclusion, and cities from Mukden and Shenyang all the way down to Guangzhou fell like bowling pins in that 10-month period, or 11-month period between November 1948 and September, October 1949. Going on to slide 27, we'll wrap this up. I've already really told you about leaning to one side. Mao Zedong wrote about that a good 6 months before the end of the war. And the thing that really spoiled relations with the Chinese is that the communists decided to take prisoner the entire staff of about 25 people of the American consulate in Shenyang, or Mukden. And I've attached a short newsreel about their release that's under the course content. Mao traveled to Moscow right after 1949 to negotiate a mutual assistance treaty with Stalin, and as you can see in this photograph, they got along really well. Actually, it was a hellish trip for Mao. Stalin made him wait for weeks and weeks before finally settling down to negotiations, and I haven't read anything from historians that make clear exactly why he was doing this, unless it was just a psychological game of sorts. This was Mao's first trip outside of China. And the thing to remember about Mao Zedong entering into this period as we move forward and talk about the People's Republic and his rule through 1976 when he died, is that Mao Zedong had taken the communist movement from near disaster to victory in only 12 years, or 13 years. It was viewed by those in the party as an unbelievable accomplishment, because no one dreamed back in 1940 that the communists would prevail before the end of the decade. This lent great prestige to Mao Zedong. His judgment had always proved correct, and this was, after all, a country that was not very far out of 2,000 years of an emperor system, and so it was only natural that people viewed Mao in some of the same ways as a victorious new emperor was viewed in traditional times. And so the last slide, 28, a long isolation began. There was an embargo placed on China by the United Nations, which enhanced the value of Hong Kong and Macau. We'll talk more next week about the growth of the Mao cult that nobody understood outside of China, except in Russia, of course, where there was already quite a cult of personality that worshipped Stalin. And one cannot necessarily say there was a cause and effect relationship between them, but one did follow the other. But there's a continuity. Even today, some people have written in the press that China is becoming a status quo power, and I hope to address that in some detail in the last 2 weeks of the course. I would argue that China is not at all a status quo power. It's an anti-status quo power, because from the time of the founding of the People's Republic, the international system has been superpower dominated, and China has sought in different ways the leadership of China has sought through the decades to overturn that system so that the country can resume its traditional status of being the suzerain power of Asia. And I don't know if I go beyond that and say world power, but that remains to be seen. In any case, next week we'll talk more about the early years of the PRC and the developments that occurred in those times. Thanks very much.